A son mocks his own parents. Royal Guard sees everything and takes action. The grand gates of Buckingham Palace shimmered under the morning sun, their gold detailing catching the light as a crowd gathered to admire the iconic landmark. Tourists snapped pictures, families huddled together, and children pointed at the towering guards standing perfectly still in their red uniforms and black bearskin hats. But not Ethan. He stood several steps away from his parents, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his designer jacket, his jaw tight with irritation. The grandeur of the palace and the history surrounding it meant nothing to him. All he could think about was how much he didn't want to be here. "This is ridiculous," Ethan muttered under his breath. "What was that?" his mother Linda asked, turning toward him. Her voice was soft and tired, like someone trying too hard to keep the peace. Ethan rolled his eyes. "I said this is ridiculous. We don't belong here. Actually, you don't belong here. Just look at you two." His words cut sharper than he intended, but he didn't bother to soften them. His father Mark stiffened but said nothing. He simply adjusted the sleeves of his old tweed jacket, the same one Ethan had seen him wear for years. The fabric had started to fray at the cuffs, and the buttons barely held on. His mother's coat wasn't much better, faded at the seams, outdated in style, and completely out of place compared to the fashionable tourists surrounding them. Linda lowered her gaze, brushing imaginary dust off her coat. "We thought it would be nice to spend some time together. To see something beautiful." "Beautiful?" Ethan scoffed. "What's beautiful about reminding ourselves how far we've fallen?" Mark finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough, Ethan." "No, it's not enough," Ethan snapped, his voice rising. A few tourists turned to look, and his mother shifted uncomfortably under their stares. "You dragged me here like this is some kind of family outing when all I can think about is how embarrassing it is to be seen with you." Linda flinched, her eyes glistening. Mark took a step closer to Ethan, his jaw tightening. "Watch your tone." "Or what?" Ethan said bitterly. "You'll ground me? Cut my allowance? Oh wait, you already did that when you lost everything." His words hung heavy in the air, sharp and cutting. His parents exchanged a look, one Ethan couldn't quite read. Guilt? Sadness? Disappointment? He didn't care. To him, they deserved it. Few years ago, Ethan had lived in luxury. Private schools, fancy vacations, and closets filled with designer clothes. His parents had run a successful business, until it all fell apart. Poor investments, bad partnerships, and a market crash wiped out their savings overnight. The house was sold. The cars were gone. And Ethan's life, his perfect, shiny life, came crashing down with it. Now they lived in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of London. His father worked long hours at a factory, and his mother took shifts as a cashier to make ends meet. Meanwhile, Ethan was forced to take public transport and shop at discount stores, surrounded by people he used to look down on. And here they were, standing in front of Buckingham Palace, pretending nothing had changed. Pretending they were still the family they used to be. A slight movement caught Ethan's attention. One of the royal guards stationed near the gate, the one directly facing them, shifted his stance ever so slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Ethan noticed it. The guard's red uniform was spotless, his black bearskin hat towering over his head. He gripped his rifle with precise form, his expression unreadable. Ethan glared at him. "What are you looking at?" he muttered under his breath, his anger now bleeding into irritation. Linda pulled at his sleeve. "Ethan, stop." But Ethan wasn't done. "What's he even doing here? Standing there like a statue while the rest of us have to figure out how to survive in the real world." Mark's voice was low but firm. "That's enough, Ethan." "Why?" "He's not going to move. He's just a glorified mannequin." Linda stepped between them, whispering, "Please stop it. People are staring." And they were. The tourists nearby were no longer pretending not to notice the family's argument. Some looked uncomfortable. Others were outright amused. But Ethan didn't stop, not until he noticed the guard move again. This time, the shift was more obvious. The guard, whose nameplate read Corporal David Clark, adjusted his grip on the rifle. It wasn't much, but it felt deliberate, like a silent warning. Ethan froze. Was the guard watching him? No, he couldn't be. The guards weren't supposed to move or speak unless there was an emergency. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Corporal Clark's gaze was fixed directly on him, and for the first time since the argument started, unease began to creep into his chest. Ethan stepped back, suddenly feeling exposed. His parents noticed a shift in his demeanor but said nothing, clearly relieved that he had stopped yelling. Linda placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We didn't bring you here to upset you. We thought it might remind you that life goes on, that we can rebuild." "Rebuild?" Ethan scoffed, though his voice was quieter now. "You don't build palaces on broken foundations." Mark sighed. "That's not true. Every legacy has its struggles. Even the royal family faced hardships, but they endured. And so will we." Ethan didn't respond. He wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he looked back at the royal guard, who had returned to his stillness but whose presence now felt heavier, almost watchful. He turned away and walked a few steps, trying to shake the unease. He hated how unsettled he felt, how his emotions were spiraling out of control. Corporal David Clark hadn't moved since their brief moment of eye contact, but something about him felt unsettling. It wasn't just his stillness. It was the way he looked at Ethan, like he could see straight through the bravado Ethan wore like armor. Ethan clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He hated that feeling. The feeling of being small. His parents walked ahead in silence. Linda's shoulders were hunched, and Mark looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his back. The image made Ethan's frustration bubble up all over again. "Why are we even here?" Ethan muttered under his breath, but loud enough for his parents to hear. Linda turned, her face tight with worry. Can I just what?" Ethan snapped, cutting her off. "Pretend we're still who we used to be? Pretend you didn't ruin everything?" Mark finally turned around, his voice sharp. "Watch your tone." "No," Ethan shot back. "I won't. I'm sick of pretending like this is fine." Linda flinched, and Mark's jaw tightened, but Ethan kept going. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several people turned to stare, whispering as they glanced at the family. Ethan saw phones raised, people recording. But instead of backing down, his frustration boiled over. Everyone here probably thinks we're nobodies, because that's exactly what we are now. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Tears welled in her eyes. Mark's hands tightened into fists at his sides, but he didn't say a word either. And then, the royal guard moved, once again. It started with a single, deliberate step forward. The sharp clack of Corporal David Clark's boots against the stone pavement cut through the air, snapping everyone's attention toward him. Ethan froze. He took another step, closing the distance between them, his rifle held firmly at his side. The crowd fell silent. The tourists who had been snapping pictures moments earlier now stared, their cameras hanging uselessly in their hands. Ethan swallowed hard. His voice, so loud just seconds ago, suddenly felt like it had been stolen from him. The guard stopped directly in front of him. The tension was suffocating. Linda looked like she was about to faint, and Mark instinctively stepped closer to her. And then, the guard spoke. "Mind your words, young man." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority, the kind that didn't need to shout to demand attention. Ethan's mouth fell open. The crowd gasped again. The royal guard had broken protocol. Ethan tried to recover, but his voice wavered. You're not supposed to talk. And you're not supposed to mock your parents." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. The guard's eyes, cold, sharp, and unwavering, were locked onto him. It was like being pinned in place, unable to look away. Ethan stepped back. "You can't talk to me like that. You don't know me." "I know enough." The guard's voice didn't waver. "I know weakness when I see it. And that is exactly what you're showing right now." Ethan flinched, his anger bubbling back to the surface. Weakness? You don't know what we've been through. No, the guard replied calmly. But I know what they've been through. And I see who's still standing. That's strength. Mark tensed beside Linda, his hand protectively resting on her back, but he didn't speak. Ethan's chest tightened as the crowd began murmuring again. Now, the guard continued, his tone firm. Now you will step aside. Now, or I will have you removed. Ethan's eyes widened. Removed? Could he do that? He was just a guard, wasn't he? But something about the steel in the man's voice told Ethan he wasn't bluffing. Ethan's parents began to turn away, their faces pale and humiliated, but Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding. For the first time in his life, someone had challenged him. Not with anger. Not with shouting. But with discipline, and it terrified him more than anything. He stumbled back, his gaze flickering between the royal guard and the faces in the crowd. The phones were still recording. People were still watching. Linda reached out for his arm. Come on, Ethan. Let's go. Ethan didn't argue. He followed them, his face burning with embarrassment, but his mind raced. Who was this guard? Why did he care? And why did his words, the words of a stranger, sting more than anything Ethan's parents had ever said to him? As the family disappeared into the crowd, Ethan couldn't help but glance back one last time. The Royal Guard, Corporal David Clark, had already returned to his position. Standing tall. Unmoving. But something about him felt different now. To Ethan, he no longer looked like a statue. He looked like someone who knew the truth. Later Ethan followed his parents through the crowd, his feet dragging and his head spinning. The guard's voice echoed in Ethan's ears, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake it. It wasn't just what the guard had said, it was how he'd said it. Calm. Sure. Like he knew something Ethan didn't. Who does he think he is? Asked Ethan. Mark slowed his steps but didn't turn around. What? That guard. Ethan snapped. Who does he think he is, talking to me like that? It's not his job to give life lessons. Mark stopped walking and turned. His eyes, usually kind, were sharp now. Maybe someone had to, Ethan. The words hit harder than Ethan expected. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, a deep voice interrupted. He knows who I am. Ethan spun around. It was Corporal David Clark. The guard was no longer standing at attention. Instead, he had walked after them, his movements as steady and purposeful as before. He stopped just a few feet away, and this time, there was no rifle in his hands. The sight of him without his weapon made him feel more human, and somehow, even more intimidating. What do you mean? Ethan demanded, his voice rising. You don't know us. Corporal Clark's eyes didn't waver. I know your father. Ethan blinked. What? No, you don't. I do, the guard said simply, before turning his gaze toward Mark, who looked just as stunned as Ethan. I haven't seen you in years, sir. But I never forgot what you did for my family. Linda gasped softly, and Mark's face paled. Wait, what is he talking about? Ethan asked, looking between them. Mark hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like he was struggling to find the right words. But before he could speak, the guard continued. Few years ago, my father worked for your family business, Corporal Clark said, his voice steady. He wasn't important, just another worker on the factory floor. But when the recession hit and the company started losing money, most businesses did what they always do. He paused. They laid people off. Ethan's stomach tightened. But your father didn't. Clark continued, now looking directly at Mark. Instead, he sold his own assets. His home. His car. Everything he had. He kept the factory running, even though it meant losing his own comfort, so people like my father could keep feeding their families. Ethan's breath caught. He stared at his father, waiting for him to deny it, to call it a mistake, or say the guard had confused him with someone else. But Mark said nothing. Because it was true. Clark's voice softened. My father never forgot that. And neither did I. Ethan's mind raced. It didn't make sense. None of it did. His father wasn't a hero. He wasn't selfless. He was just ordinary. That's not true, Ethan said quickly. It can't be. Clark's expression didn't change. Believe what you want. But it happened. Ethan turned to Mark. Why didn't you tell me? Mark finally spoke, his voice low and careful. Because it wasn't about recognition, Ethan. It was about doing what was right. But we lost everything, Ethan snapped. You didn't save us, you ruined us. Mark flinched, but before he could respond, Clark stepped in. Ruined you? He said sharply. You're standing here, aren't you? Wearing designer shoes and complaining about parents who gave up their comfort so other people wouldn't starve. That's what you call ruined? Ethan's face burned. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, Clark replied. His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. Strength isn't about how much you have. It's about how much you're willing to give up for others. Ethan opened his mouth to argue again, but the words stuck in his throat. He didn't want to believe the story. It made him feel small, like all his anger, all his resentment, had been built on lies. He had spent the past year blaming his parents, hating them for losing everything, but now, he didn't know what to feel. Linda spoke softly, breaking the silence. We didn't want you to know, Ethan. We didn't want you to carry the weight of it. But I am carrying it, Ethan said, his voice cracking. And I don't know how to let it go. Clark stepped closer. Then start by understanding that sacrifice isn't weakness, it's strength. Real strength. Ethan's shoulders sagged. He felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. For the first time, he looked at his father and saw something different. Not failure. Not weakness. But courage. Clark's words lingered as he stepped back, his presence still towering. You're angry, Clark said, his tone softer now. That's fine. But anger won't fix what's broken. Ethan swallowed hard. What will? Learning from it. The guard gave Mark a brief nod, one of respect, before stepping back into formation. And just like that, it was as if he never moved. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him like stone. His parents turned to leave, but this time, Ethan didn't trail behind them. He walked beside them. And as they moved away from the palace gates, Ethan glanced back at Corporal David Clark one last time. The guard stood tall, silent, disciplined, and unyielding. Ethan stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror later that night. The hotel lights were dim, but the harsh shadows under his eyes told their own story. He splashed cold water on his face, hoping it might quiet the storm in his head, but it didn't. His chest tightened. He'd mocked his parents, torn them down, called them weak. And all the while, they'd been carrying a burden he never knew existed. He gripped the sink, his knuckles turning white. How had he been so blind? When Ethan stepped out of the bathroom, his parents were sitting quietly in the small living area. Linda glanced up first, her eyes red from crying, while Mark sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap. Ethan hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say. The usual words, excuses, sarcasm, deflection, felt hollow now. Finally, Mark broke the silence. You didn't eat dinner, he said. His voice was calm, but tired. I wasn't hungry, Ethan mumbled. Linda spoke softly. Sit down, Ethan. He obeyed, sinking onto the edge of the couch. The silence stretched again, heavy and unbearable, until Ethan finally blurted out. I didn't know. Mark's head lifted. I didn't know what you gave up, Ethan said, his voice raw. I thought you just gave up. That you let everything fall apart. Mark's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. And now? Ethan swallowed hard. Now I don't know what to think. Linda leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, Ethan. But you do need to decide what kind of man you want to be moving forward. Her words struck deep. Ethan clenched his fists. I don't want to be this. I don't want to be angry all the time. Mark's voice cut through. Then stop looking for someone to blame. Ethan froze. Anger is easier than admitting you're scared. Mark continued. Scared of losing control. Scared of being seen as less than you were. Ethan's face burned because it was true. Later that night, Ethan sat alone, scrolling through his phone. His old life stared back at him, the photos, the vacations, the endless parties. He barely recognized himself in them. He looked carefree, confident, untouchable. But as he stared closer, the cracks began to show. He remembered those nights, how he'd always been the loudest, always trying to prove something. Prove he was important. Prove he was enough. And now? Now he wasn't sure if he ever had been. He clicked out of the photos and opened his messages. A group chat with old friends sat untouched for months. He scrolled up to the last messages, texts mocking his parents, jokes about their fall from wealth. He'd laughed at the time. Now it made his stomach turn. For the first time, he saw his old life for what it really was, a mask. Ethan stayed awake for hours before finally opening his laptop. The email started out formal, almost stiff. Dear Corporal Clark. He deleted it and tried again. David. No. Still wrong. Finally, he let the words spill out, raw and unpolished. I don't even know how to start this. I don't think you were trying to humiliate me today, but it felt like it. And maybe that's because I deserved it. You were right about a lot of things, about my parents, about strength. I've spent so long being angry at them for losing everything that I didn't see what they actually gave up. Or why. I don't know if I'll ever be like them. I don't know if I'll ever understand what it means to sacrifice like that. But I'm starting to think maybe I should try. I just wanted to say, thank you. He read it twice, debating whether to send it. What if Clark didn't care? What if this just made him look weaker? But then he remembered the look in Clark's eyes, calm, steady, and unshaken. And he hit send. The next morning, Ethan felt different. Not fixed. Not whole. But lighter, like he'd finally set something down after carrying it for too long. His parents were already dressed when he stepped into the living room. Morning, he said. Mark raised an eyebrow. Morning. Do we have time before we head out? Ethan asked. Time for what? I want to go back to the palace. Linda's eyes widened. Why? Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. I just need to see something. They didn't argue. The palace gates were quieter this time, the morning crowd still filtering in. Ethan stood near the edge, scanning the line of guards until he spotted Clark. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. Clark's eyes flickered in his direction, and for a brief moment, they locked. Ethan gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. And Clark returned it. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement. As Ethan turned to leave, he glanced back one last time. The royal guard stood tall and unyielding. But this time, Ethan didn't see judgment. He saw expectation. And for the first time, he felt like he might be ready to meet it. Later that afternoon, Ethan wandered through the busy streets of London while his parents rested at the hotel. He had promised himself that he was ready to change, to stop blaming his parents, and start taking responsibility. But the weight of his past followed him. That became clear when his phone rang. Derek, his friend, called. Ethan hesitated but answered. Hey. Dude. Finally. You went off the grid or something. Ethan forced a laugh. Yeah, something like that. Well, listen, we're at a rooftop bar near Trafalgar Square. Drinks, music, and no judgment. Get over here and take a break from your sad family vacation. Ethan froze. He could hear the laughter in the background, the clinking of glasses, the carefree chatter. It was familiar. Comfortable. But then his father's words came back to him. Stop looking for someone to blame. Ethan closed his eyes. Not tonight, he said finally. Derek scoffed. What? Are you serious? Man, what happened to you? Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. I'm just figuring some things out. Well, let us know when you're done playing Saint, Derek said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The call ended. And for the first time, Ethan didn't feel the need to prove anything. The sun was setting by the time Ethan returned to the hotel. He found his father sitting alone by the window, staring out over the city. Where's Mom? Ethan asked. Lying down, Mark said without looking up. It's been a long day for her. Ethan sat down across from him, but the silence felt heavier than usual. Finally, Mark spoke. You didn't have to come back. Ethan frowned. What are you talking about? Mark turned to face him. I saw the way you were looking at your phone earlier. You're still tied to that life, aren't you? No, Ethan said quickly, but Mark's expression told him he didn't believe it. Ethan sighed. I turned them down. My friends. They wanted me to go out, but I didn't. Mark's eyes softened. Why not? Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. Because I'm tired of pretending. Tired of acting like nothing's wrong. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying his son. Then stop pretending, Ethan. Be better. But don't do it for me or your mother. Do it because you want to. Ethan nodded slowly, but deep down, he wondered if he was strong enough to follow through. The next morning, Ethan decided to go for a walk to clear his head. Halfway there, his phone buzzed. A message. It was a video, sent anonymously. Ethan clicked on it, and his stomach dropped. It was him. At the palace gates. Mocking his parents. Calling them pathetic nobodies. The footage had been taken by someone in the crowd, and now it was online. Thousands of views. Hundreds of comments. Typical rich kid tantrum. Entitled brat gets what he deserves. Spoiled and shameless. Ethan's hands shook. He scrolled faster, hoping for something better, but it only got worse. The clip had gone viral. The weight of it hit him hard. All the progress he thought he'd made suddenly felt pointless. He turned and sprinted back to the hotel. Ethan burst into the room, startling his parents. Mark stood immediately. What's wrong? They filmed it. Ethan blurted out, shoving the phone toward him. It's all over the internet. Everyone's laughing at me. At us. Mark took the phone, scrolling through the comments before setting it down on the table. Ethan paced, his thoughts spiraling. This is never going away. Everyone's going to see it. My friends probably already have. Mark stepped in front of him, forcing Ethan to stop moving. Look at me, Mark said firmly. Ethan did. This doesn't define you. How can you say that? Ethan snapped. It's right there, proof of who I am. No, Mark said, his voice steady. It's proof of who you were. But it doesn't have to be who you are. Ethan shook his head. You don't get it. Mark grabbed Ethan's shoulders. I do get it. I know what it feels like to be judged, to have people question your choices, to carry guilt. But you're the only one who decides what happens next. Ethan's breathing slowed. You said you didn't want to be this person anymore. Mark continued. So don't be. Let them see the real you, the one who's willing to face his mistakes and fix them. Ethan's eyes stung, but he nodded. Later that night, Ethan sat down and opened his phone. The viral video was still trending, but this time, he didn't flinch. Instead, he started typing. You're right. I acted like a spoiled brat, and I let my anger get the best of me. But I'm not proud of it. I'm learning. And I'll keep learning, because my parents deserve better. So do I. He hesitated for only a moment before hitting post. Ethan stood outside the palace gates again, but this time, the weight in his chest felt different. No anger. No resentment. Just resolve. The video was still spreading online, but something strange had happened in the comments. People weren't just mocking him anymore. They were listening. Some had called his apology fake, but others defended him, especially after someone shared David Clark's story. His dad saved my uncle's job back in the recession. The kid owned up. That takes guts. We all make mistakes. At least he's trying to fix his. Ethan hadn't expected anyone to believe him. He hadn't expected kindness. But now that it had come, he didn't want to let it go. Corporal David Clark was back in formation, his rifle resting at his side. Ethan hesitated before stepping closer. Clark's eyes flickered toward him but didn't move. His face remained stoic. Ethan cleared his throat. "I need to talk to you." Clark didn't respond. "I know you can't break protocol," Ethan continued, "but I just wanted to say thank you for everything you said. And I wanted you to know." He swallowed, his voice shaking. "I get it now." Clark's gaze shifted slightly, just enough for Ethan to notice. "I'm not asking for you to fix it. I needed to own what I did. To you. To my parents." Ethan waited, hoping for something, a nod, a look, anything. And then, Clark blinked. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough. Ethan smiled faintly and stepped back, letting Clark return to his post. Ethan found his parents sitting at a cafe nearby. Linda looked up nervously when she saw him approach, and Mark set his phone down. "Hey," Ethan said, sliding into the seat beside them. Linda's voice wavered. "We saw your post." Ethan braced himself. "And?" Mark leaned forward. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Ethan said firmly. "I don't want to keep pretending anymore. You both deserve better than how I treated you." Linda wiped at her eyes. "Ethan. No, let me finish." He took a breath. "I was angry because I thought you'd ruined everything. But I get it now. You didn't ruin it, you gave it up for the right reasons. And the truth is, I'm proud of you." Linda broke into quiet tears, and Mark reached across the table, squeezing Ethan's shoulder. "We're proud of you too," Mark said softly. "You've still got a lot to learn, but this is a good start." Ethan nodded, unable to trust his voice. Later that evening, Ethan checked his inbox and saw an unread message. From Corporal David Clark. He clicked it immediately. "Ethan, I saw your post today. I wasn't sure if you'd actually follow through, but you did. And that matters more than you think. You're right, you have a long way to go. But growth isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to show up, even when it's uncomfortable. If you ever need help figuring out the next steps, let me know. David, ***. Ethan stared at the screen, his chest tightening. Help? For the first time, he didn't feel like he was alone. The next morning, Ethan woke up early and joined his parents for breakfast. "I was thinking," he said, pushing his plate aside. "Maybe it's time I start doing something real. Not just talking about changing, but actually doing it." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know yet. But I was hoping maybe I could start by helping Mom look for work, or volunteering somewhere while we figure things out." Linda's eyes widened. "You want to help me?" Ethan nodded. "It's the least I can do." Mark leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I think that's a great idea." A week later, Ethan stood outside a local shelter, nervously smoothing his shirt. His parents had already started volunteering there months ago, but this was his first time showing up on his own. He wanted to turn around. To run. But then he thought about Clark. About his father. About the stories of sacrifice and strength. And he stepped inside. That night, Ethan sat with Mark on the balcony of their hotel. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Selling the company. Losing everything." Mark thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "Not once." Ethan frowned. "Why?" "Because it taught me what really matters. And now, it's teaching you too." Ethan looked out over the city lights, his chest lighter than it had been in months. A month later, the video of Ethan's meltdown finally faded into obscurity. But Ethan didn't. He kept showing up, at the shelter, at home, in ways that actually mattered. It wasn't easy. He still had moments of frustration, of doubt. But now, he had purpose. And every time he felt himself slipping back into old habits, he thought of Clark, standing tall and unyielding. A reminder of who he had been. And who he was becoming. Ethan returned to the palace gates months later. Clark was there, rifle in hand. This time, Ethan didn't hesitate. He walked straight up to him, meeting his eyes with confidence. Clark didn't move, but Ethan saw it. The slightest nod. And this time, Ethan nodded back. Not as an apology. Not as shame. But as respect.